What I'm about to tell you didn't happen to me, but to my sister. I'm not going to mention any names because, unfortunately, it was a highly publicized case at the end of the last century, and our family suffered a lot because of it. In fact, we still do. This event marked us in a way that few could ever understand, and perhaps that's why we collectively decided never to talk about what happened, as if silence could somehow erase what took place. We have no explanation for what happened, so we just pretend, when we're all together, that nothing ever happened. That we've always been a normal family, an intact family. But the truth is, we each suffer in private, carrying a shadow that refuses to fade away. What hurts me the most is never having found a reason, and knowing that I'll probably die without ever finding one. The reason I'm sharing this story is in the hope that someone out there might have a rational explanation, or maybe to discover people who've gone through similar situations. I long for answers, for some comfort in logic or science that might give us back some sense of understanding. I was born in 1989, and my sister in 1994. We weren't that far apart in age. But it was enough for me to remember everything that happened with a clarity that sometimes haunts me. In 1999, our family decided, as usual, to take a vacation in Susquehannock State Forest. It was a tradition. We are a big family, full of cousins and uncles, and we loved the freedom those getaways gave us. Almost every year, whenever we could, we'd all gather and camp out in that forest. Today, just mentioning the name brings an unease that no one expresses, but we all feel. We haven't been back there since that year. Back then, we'd pretty much do the same things. Set up several big tents that amazed me with their size. They seemed like real houses to me. And each family would get one. The routine was almost ritualistic. Some of us would hike through the forest, others played cards or read books, while a third group preferred to cool off in the creek waters. I loved those moments. It was such simple, pure joy. But in 1999, it was forever tainted. It was the end of an ordinary day, and we were all gathered around the campfire. The darkness was beginning to swallow the forest, and the crackling of the flames was the only sound, besides our laughter. We were telling stories, each one funnier than the last. However, my sister was being a bit annoying, kind of restless. She wanted to play with me at all costs, but I was tired. I told her to take a hike, maybe with more impatience than I should have. Disappointed, she got the hint and went over to our cousins who were playing a little farther away. I remember seeing my mom and aunts watching her, constantly glancing in the direction of the kids. They were always alert, as if they somehow sensed that something could go wrong. Time passed, and after an hour, the worry on my mom's face became evident. She suddenly stood up and called out for my sister. She didn't seem worried, just puzzled that she couldn't see her where she had just moments before. However, something in her eyes changed when there was no response. At first, no one was alarmed. I myself had seen my sister playing just a short while ago. But as the minutes passed and her silence continued, my mom's concern started to overflow. She called my dad, and that's when the search really began. The whole family got up and spread out into the forest around the campsite. The air was heavy, loaded with a growing anxiety that squeezed my chest. After 45 minutes that felt like 5 hours, with no sign of her, we decided to call the police. My mom was convinced that someone had taken her. My sister was only 5 years old, and the terrain we were on was not easy. We searched a huge area, combed every inch of the surroundings, called out for her until our voices were hoarse, but nothing. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, without a trace. That night was the beginning of a nightmare that no one was prepared to face. The police questioned us repeatedly, making us relive the last moments we saw her, as if there was some detail we had forgotten. They asked if anyone had ever shown any interest in my sister, if we had crossed paths with any strangers along the way or on the trails, if our family had enemies, or if anyone had heard a sound, a noise, anything out of the ordinary. But the answer to everything was always the same. Nothing. No clues, no hints. My mom, in a desperate attempt to find a connection, remembered an incident that had happened months earlier. A strange man had approached her on the street, commenting that my sister was very pretty. It wasn't something she had given much importance to at the time, but when she recalled it, a feeling of discomfort came over her. Mothers have a peculiar instinct, an almost supernatural ability to sense invisible threats. What might seem harmless to anyone else didn't to her. She was unsettled by the man's approach, by the way he looked at my sister. The problem was that this had happened months ago, almost a year. The man's description was now vague in my mom's memory, and the police, though attentive, decided they couldn't waste their resources chasing a ghost. The first hours are crucial when it comes to missing children, so they focused on scouring the forest from one end to the other. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. But we had hope. They called in divers to search the river. A helicopter flew over the area, and several dogs were brought in, but all in vain. They didn't find any clues, not even a hint of where she might be. The dogs kept circling as if she was everywhere. After 3 days, my family was on the verge of breaking down. My mom couldn't sleep, her eyes swollen from crying so much. My dad was hysterical, arguing with everyone, maybe in a desperate attempt to channel his frustration. My cousins and uncles were lost, not knowing how to help, while I felt like a shadow, apathetic, unable to process what was happening. On the 4th day, the phone calls started coming in. People claiming to have seen my sister at gas stations nearby, others swearing they'd seen her in neighboring towns. Each call, a new hope. But none of these sightings matched her description exactly. Each of those false hopes was like a stab, a pain that reminded us of the uncertainty that was suffocating us. On the 5th day, one of the dogs found something that scared us even more. My sister's shoes were discovered near a stream, over 16 miles from our campsite. It was a mystery how they had ended up there. We considered the possibility that she had been swept away by the current, but most of the creek didn't have enough force to carry a body, let alone that of a 5-year-old child. The scenario was becoming more and more sinister. We seriously began to believe that she wasn't lost, but rather that she had been abducted, just as my mom had thought from the beginning. The idea that such a small child could walk 16 miles through that terrain, without water, without food, was simply impossible. Something else was at play. Then, on the 7th day, a search party made a discovery that would shake our convictions even more. About 4 miles from where the shoes had been found, they saw her. My sister was sitting on the ground, calm, playing with a doll. The sight was surreal, almost unreal. How was it possible? A 5-year-old child, missing for 7 days in the middle of the forest, over 20 miles from where she had disappeared, and with no food. It was something that defied logic, common sense. She was quickly taken to the hospital, but to everyone's surprise, she was fine. Aside from a few scratches and some weight loss, there was nothing wrong with her. 3 days later, she was discharged and came home with us. We were happy, of course, but there was a fear, a latent terror that consumed us. What had she gone through? How had she survived? And that doll, where had it come from? When my sister started talking about what happened to her, her answers left us even more perplexed. She spoke very calmly and slowly, not at all like a child, and certainly not like her. She had always been restless, talked loudly, and often cried when she didn't get what she wanted. She said she didn't remember much of anything. There were no clear memories, just fragments. She stated with an odd serenity that she had been alone the whole time, that she slept among the trees and found the doll in a flower garden. Susquehannock is indeed known for its immense variety of wildflowers, but no one could understand what garden she was referring to. The shoes, she said, she left by the stream because Mommy had always told her she couldn't go in the water with shoes on. The innocence of her words contrasted with the enormity of the mystery surrounding her disappearance. The police never reached any concrete conclusion. Their investigation hit a dead end. The experts said My sister's case was an enigma, something that defied all rescue models for children her age who get lost in the forest. As time went on, we talked less and less about what happened. It was as if the silence could somehow erase that episode from our history. Today, it's a taboo in our family. No one mentions Susquehannock, and we avoid any conversation about that summer of 1999 at all costs. Meanwhile, I'm obsessed with this story. It chills me to think that my sister doesn't remember what happened to her, that the mystery remains unsolved. I have more questions than answers, and it consumes me, slowly, every day. She was never the same after that. She's very shy and reserved now, never tells us anything. But she's always drawing, mostly drawings of scary forests, figures in the middle of the forest at night. Truly frightening drawings. She's never shown them to me, or to anyone in the family. But one day, I found her notebook and saw the drawings. I was completely frozen. What happened in those woods? Who or what was with her during those 7 days? I'll probably never have an answer. But maybe, by sharing our story, I might find someone who's gone through something similar. The story I'm about to tell you happened a few years ago, back when my friends and I were still teenagers, full of curiosity and a drive to explore the unknown. For us, adventure always had to involve abandoned places, isolated spots that most people would avoid. It was like we were drawn to these locations, almost like a magnet. And so, one fall afternoon, we decided to follow an old, unused railroad track that ran through the outskirts of our town. The day was gray and overcast, with the sun hidden behind a thick layer of clouds that seemed impenetrable. The air was cold and damp, and the dry leaves crunched beneath our feet as we walked. The railroad, abandoned for decades, wound its way through the countryside like a scar in the landscape, covered in moss and rust. Some of the wooden ties were rotting, nearly disintegrated, and the rails seemed to dissolve into the distance, vanishing at the horizon. That place had an aura of mystery and abandonment that fascinated us, like it was a time capsule forgotten by the world. I remember thinking that maybe I could become an explorer of these places. I imagined creating an Instagram account, making it my life, like so many other content creators. But after what we experienced that day, that idea vanished completely. There were 4 of us: me, Samuel, David, and Amelia. We grew up together, and back then we were inseparable. When I suggested exploring the old railroad, no one hesitated to join in. That day we followed the track, laughing and chatting about trivial things as we moved further and further away from the town. Despite the growing discomfort, there was something peaceful about being so far from everything. But at the same time, I felt an inexplicable unease, a strange sensation I couldn't shake off. After an hour of walking, the initial excitement started to fade. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded only by weeds and an almost palpable silence. The sound of our footsteps and our voices were the only interruptions in the stillness of that place. But despite the growing discomfort, none of us wanted to be the first to suggest turning back. There was something in the atmosphere that made us feel a weight in our chests, but youth and the desire for adventure spoke louder. That's when we saw something in the distance, something that didn't seem to belong there. A metal structure emerged as we got closer. When we finally approached it, we realized it was an old train carriage, isolated, like it had been abandoned and forgotten in that spot. It was covered in rust, with dirty and broken windows, and it looked like it had been there rotting for years. For the first time during that walk, I felt a surge of excitement. I looked at my friends and saw that they felt the same. Finally, something worth exploring. However, over the years, and now as I recount this story, I realize I should have listened to my instincts, should have suggested we turn back. But we were in a group, we were young, and excitement and stupidity outweighed any gut feelings. As we approached the carriage, I noticed something that made me uncomfortable. Despite its decrepit and dirty appearance, some parts were clean, as if someone had been there recently. The lock on the door, for instance, was surprisingly new, clearly placed there not long ago. Samuel, who was the most experienced with these kinds of things, had no trouble breaking the lock, but I noticed he was also slightly uneasy about it. Nothing could have prepared us for what we found inside. The walls of the carriage were covered in gruesome photographs, images of human body parts, and there were stains of dried blood everywhere. The rest of the carriage was empty, but that scene alone was enough to make us feel sick. As I looked closely at the photographs, I realized they were of people, from children to adults. I looked out the only intact window to hold back the tears that were streaming down, and what I saw made my heart stop. Among the trees, something was moving, running towards us. I can't accurately describe what it was, but it looked like a man, disfigured, moving almost like an animal. I didn't think twice and started running, screaming for my friends to follow me. They were so petrified by what they had seen that they didn't hesitate to run after me. What happened next is shrouded in a fog in my memory. I believe the shock blocked out a lot of the memories, but I remember running, screaming, feeling the fear pumping through my veins. I have no idea how long that thing chased us. Samuel insists it was for a long time. The sensation of being hunted still haunts me to this day. We didn't go to the police immediately, and now, looking back, I know that was a huge mistake. But we were just kids, terrified and confused. We didn't even know what we had seen. 2 days passed before our parents realized something was wrong and forced us to tell them what had happened. Samuel, being the most articulate, was the first to report everything to the police. Unfortunately, it was too late by then. When the police finally got to the site, the carriage was gone, like it had never been there. They only found traces of blood and a few blood-stained objects scattered along the tracks. They never found what chased us, nor did they identify the victims in the photographs. The most disturbing aspect of the entire story is the mystery surrounding the missing carriage. How could something so large vanish without a trace? The more I ponder it, the more unsettling it becomes. What haunts me the most, even now, is that no one was ever held accountable for those horrific crimes, and the victims remain nameless and forgotten.